prevailing wisdom for the last 50 years in the halls of power in Washington was a simple, unspoken rule. They need us more than we need them. It was the fundamental assumption that underpinned every trade deal, every diplomatic meeting, and every strategic forecast. The logic was that Canada was effectively a giant warehouse for the United States, a quiet, friendly neighbor to the north where we kept the extra oil, the spare timber, and the mineral wealth until we were ready to use it. We treated the border like a formality and the country like a 51st state that just happened to have its own flag. We assumed that because we have the massive consumer market, the world's reserve currency, and the most powerful military on the planet, Canada would always fall in line. If we pushed, they would bend. If we demanded, they would comply. But on this morning, Friday, January 30, 2026, the world woke up to a reality that no one in the West Wing or on Wall Street was prepared for. We are finding out exactly what happens when the neighbor you've taken for granted finally decides he's had enough. 2 days ago, the United States government initiated a total economic shift by imposing a blanket 25% tariff on every single category of Canadian import. This wasn't just about softwood lumber or dairy quotas. It was a scorched earth policy targeting energy, raw materials, and manufactured goods. Intent was to shock Ottawa into a lopsided renegotiation of our trade agreements, essentially demanding that they hand over sovereign control of their natural resources to satisfy American industrial interests. The expectation was a quick surrender. Instead, the Canadian government did something unprecedented. They didn't just retaliate with their own taxes. They invoked emergency powers to halt the flow of goods entirely. It didn't just make the resources more expensive. They turned them off. As of this hour, the massive pipelines that carry crude oil from the Alberta sands to the American Midwest are being throttled down. The rail lines that transport the fertilizer required for the American heartland are sitting idle. The shipments of uranium that fuel our nuclear reactors have been grounded. The American economy isn't just reacting to this. It is beginning to seize up. In the last 24 hours, the price of gasoline in cities like Chicago and Minneapolis has surged by nearly $1. The commodities markets are in a state of total panic because the supply of essential agricultural inputs has vanished overnight. The Department of Energy has moved to a state of high alert, not because of a foreign invasion or a cyber attack, but because the physical ingredients required to keep the lights on and the engines turning are no longer crossing the border. We have spent a decade patting ourselves on the back for achieving energy independence, but that was a lie built on a misunderstanding of chemistry and geography. The United States is not independent. We are strategically and geologically addicted to Canada. We are currently facing a siege, and for the first time in modern history, the United States is the one trapped inside the walls. Understand why the White House is currently in a state of emergency. You have to look at the physical reality of our energy infrastructure. For years, the public has been told that the fracking revolution in places like Texas and North Dakota made us the masters of our own destiny. We pump millions of barrels of oil every day, so the average person assumes we don't need anyone else's. But oil is not a monolithic product. The oil we produce in the Permian Basin is light and thin. However, the multi-billion-dollar refineries located along the Gulf Coast and throughout the Midwest were built decades ago to process heavy, thick, sludge-like crude. These refineries are like specialized digestive systems. If you give them the wrong fuel, they don't just run slower, they break. Since the United States stopped taking oil from Venezuela and production in Mexico began to crater, there has been only one reliable source for that heavy crude: the Canadian oil sands. Every single day, Canada sends nearly 4 million barrels of oil south. This oil is the lifeblood of the American industrial machine. It is what we turn into diesel for our trucks, jet fuel for our planes, and heating oil for our homes. When the administration slapped tariffs on that energy, they thought they were taxing a foreign entity. In reality, they were taxing our own heartland. The Midwest relies on Canada for 70% of its refinery feedstock. There is no magic switch to flip to bring oil up from Texas to fill that gap. The infrastructure simply isn't there. We built a continent-wide energy machine assuming the border didn't exist, and now that the border is a wall, the machine is broken. While the U.S. was busy trying to leverage Canada, Canada was building an exit strategy. With the recent completion of the Trans Mountain pipeline expansion to the Pacific coast, Canada no longer has to sell to us at a discount. They have already begun rerouting that energy to Asia. We treated our closest ally like a captive customer, only to realize they've found a new market. Crisis doesn't stop at the gas pump. It is moving directly into the power grid. Roughly 20% of American electricity comes from nuclear power. It is the steady, reliable base of our energy system. Yet, the United States produces almost 0% of the uranium required to run those plants. After we banned imports from Russia and its satellites to protest their geopolitical moves, we became almost entirely dependent on the Athabasca Basin in Saskatchewan. This region is essentially the Saudi Arabia of uranium, containing the highest grade deposits on the planet. When the trade war escalated, Ottawa took the radical step of designating uranium as a protected national security asset. They have paused all export licenses to the United States. Nuclear reactors operate on strict refueling cycles of 18 to 24 months. They cannot simply wait for a new trade deal to be signed. If the fuel bundles aren't there, the plants have to power down. We are approaching a summer where the eastern seaboard could face rolling blackouts because we picked a fight with the only people who can keep our reactors running. And there is the issue of food. This is the part of the crisis that will hit every single American household at the dinner table. If you want to grow corn, soy, or wheat at the scale required to feed 330 million people, you need potash. It is a fundamental component of fertilizer, the K in the NPK formula that every industrial farmer uses. Russia and Belarus are major producers, but they are currently off limits due to sanctions. That leaves Canada, which produces 1/3 of the world's supply and provides 85% of the potash used by American farmers. There is no backup plan for this. We are weeks away from the spring planting season. If the fertilizer doesn't cross the border in the next 30 days, the American harvest will fail. It is that simple. Crop yields would plummet, and the price of meat, dairy, and bread would double or triple. We are looking at a self-inflicted crisis, where the very tariffs meant to protect American interests are instead starving American farms of the one thing they need to survive. For over a century, the relationship between the United States and Canada has been the most successful partnership in human history. We built an integrated, continent-wide economy under the assumption that the border was just a line on a map. We integrated our auto industry so deeply that parts for a single vehicle might cross the border 7 times before the car is finished. 25% tariff on each of those crossings doesn't just make the car more expensive, it makes it impossible to build. Thousands of auto workers in Michigan and Ohio are being sent home because the supply chain has snapped. But the defense angle is even more critical. The United States cannot build its F-35 fighter jets, its SpaceX rockets, or its armored vehicles without Canadian aluminum. We shut down our own smelters decades ago because electricity was too expensive. We relied on Quebec's massive hydropower to provide the cheap energy needed to make aluminum. Now, our defense industrial base has a gaping hole in it. We have effectively sanctioned our only clean, secure source of the metal we need to fight the next war. This trade war has exposed the fundamental fragility of the American empire. We have focused so much on projecting power across the oceans that we forgot to secure the ground beneath our feet. We treated our closest partner as a vassal state, assuming they had nowhere else to turn. But in 2026, the world is a different place. Canada has other options. They have the water, they have the minerals, and they have the energy that the rest of the world is starving for. They can afford a recession much better than we can afford a total collapse of our industrial and agricultural base. A country that produces its own food and heat can survive a long winter. A country that produces software and financial instruments cannot. We are currently witnessing the death of the autarky delusion, the belief that America can do it all alone. The standoff is forcing a reckoning with our third most important shared resource, water. The Great Lakes hold 20% of the world's surface freshwater. While we share them, Canada controls the northern flow. As the American Southwest faces historic droughts and eyes Canadian water, the trade war has turned water into a weapon. Canada has the power to adjust reservoir levels for their own hydropower needs, which would drop water levels in Washington state and Oregon, causing our own dams to lose power. It is the ultimate checkmate. You can print money and you can build weapons, but you cannot manufacture water. As the markets owe. And on Monday, keep your eyes on the tickers for the major Canadian resource companies. If those stocks are moving, it means the crisis is deepening. We will likely see a temporary exemption announced by the White House within the next 48 hours. They will call it a gesture of goodwill, but we will know the truth. They looked at the empty gas tanks in the Midwest, the darkening power grids, and the empty fertilizer sheds in the Corn Belt, and they realized that in 2026, the map hasn't changed. Geography is destiny, and we're stuck with each other. This trade war was a bluff, and Canada just called it. The siege of the American economy is not being led by a foreign dictator, but by our own refusal to acknowledge that our attic is actually our foundation. On the immediate economic shocks, we have to look at the long-term geopolitical shift this has triggered. For decades, Canada was the reliable middle power, the quiet ally that always had our back in NATO and NORAD. By forcing them into this corner, we have effectively pushed them into the arms of our competitors. The recent announcement of a strategic partnership between Ottawa and Beijing regarding energy and critical minerals should be a klaxon for every national security official. If Canada begins to prioritize Chinese demand over American needs, the entire strategic balance of the 21st century shifts. China doesn't have its own heavy crude refineries. They are building them. They don't have their own uranium mines. They are buying them. If Canada decides that the American market is too volatile to depend on, they will build the infrastructure to face the Pacific. Once those pipes are laid and those ships are loaded, they aren't coming back to the U.S. market. We are watching the permanent decoupling of the North American economy in real time, and the cost of that divorce is a price no American is ready to pay. The arrogance of the "they need us more" argument was based on 20th century thinking. It assumed that we were the only place for Canadian goods to go. But in a world of high-speed rail, massive LNG tankers, and global mineral shortages, the producer of raw materials holds the ultimate leverage. We can hurt Canada's GDP, yes. We can cause a recession in Toronto, but they can stop our cars, they can starve our crops, and they can turn off our lights. In the end, a country that produces its own food and fuel is far more resilient than a country that consumes it. This trade war didn't just expose a trade deficit, it exposed a reality deficit in our own leadership. We forgot that the nice guy next door is the one who holds the keys to our house. If you look at the Great Lakes today, you see a quiet border, but beneath the surface a tectonic shift has occurred. The United States has spent the last 30 years outsourcing its primary production, its mining, its smelting, its refining to allies, assuming they would always be there. We became a nation of designers, lawyers, and financiers. We became an economy of value add. But as every engineer knows, you can't add value to nothing. You need the base layer. Canada is our base layer. Without their aluminum, we have no planes. Without their potash, we have no bread. Without their uranium, we have no power. And without their oil, we have no movement. Final lesson of January 2026 is that the United States is part of a continent, not an island. Our strength has always come from our integration, not our isolation. The attempt to bully our closest ally into submission hasn't made us stronger. It has revealed how vulnerable we truly are. As the gas lines start to form and the supermarket shelves begin to thin, the conversation in Washington is changing from "how do we win" to "how do we apologize?" Because in the end, you can't eat an iPhone, and you can't run a tank on a stock option. You need the physical stuff of the world, and most of that stuff is currently sitting north of the 49th parallel. Thanks for watching. If you want to understand how this aluminum crisis is specifically going to dismantle the U.S. auto industry over the next 6 months, stay tuned for our next deep dive, where we look at why Detroit might be the first casualty of the trade war. Would you like me to elaborate further on the specific technical details of the uranium enrichment process or the aluminum smelting energy requirements to ensure the script reaches your exact time target?